in the newspapers or you hear on the that, of course, there will have been, people would have been prepared for this.
A sealed letter from Princess Diana, hidden for 26 years, was found in an auction house in Essex. It wasn't addressed to Charles, not William, not Harry. It was for Princess Anne. The envelope, cream-colored and untouched, bore Diana's royal letterhead and her personal red wax seal, a mark she reserved for her most private, serious messages, and it had never been opened. The shock wasn't just that it existed, it was who it was meant for. Diana and Anne were never close. One wore her heart on her sleeve. The other hid everything behind duty. Rumors of tension between them had swirled for years. Cold stares at royal events, distant smiles, and decades of silence. But this letter changed everything. Why would Diana write to Anne, of all people? What did she need to say before her death? Was it a warning? A final request? The royal family hasn't commented, but historians, handwriting experts, and insiders are calling this the most significant Diana document found in decades. The world thought their story was over. This letter says it wasn't. The discovery came quietly, almost by accident. Inside a dusty back room of an auction house in Essex, auctioneer James Parker was doing what he'd done hundreds of times before, sorting through old, forgotten possessions. He expected royal memorabilia, maybe postcards, some clippings, a commemorative teacup or two. But what he found instead made his hands freeze mid-air. At the bottom of a plain archival box, tucked between old thank you notes and household lists, was a thick cream-colored envelope. It wasn't yellowed or worn. It looked untouched, and right at the top was the royal letterhead, Kensington Palace. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, it read, in that same elegant script the world had seen in so many of Diana's notes and signatures. But what struck Parker, and later the entire world, was the wax seal on the back. Not the standard royal insignia used for official correspondence. This was something far more intimate, a deep red wax stamped with Diana's personal crest. She had only ever used it for one thing: messages meant to remain private, serious, and seen by only one person. Princess Anne. The moment the news broke, royal historians and experts descended on Essex like a storm. No one had ever seen this letter. While many of Diana's letters had been released or sold over the years, some heartfelt, some heartbreaking, this one had remained in the shadows for more than 2 decades, and it had never been opened. The chain of custody made it even more bizarre. The letter had passed through 3 private collectors since 1997. The most recent, a retired banker named Thomas Henderson, had quietly purchased it from someone who allegedly once worked within the royal household. Henderson admitted he never opened it, claiming he believed it was best left sealed out of respect. But when he passed away in late 2023, the letter ended up in the estate's belongings and back into public hands. That's when everything changed. Dr. Sarah Matthews, a leading royal historian who spent years cataloging Diana's correspondence, was among the first to examine it. "This isn't just another thank you note," she said. "This was a deliberate message to the one royal Diana never had a warm relationship with." That alone is shocking. Why would Diana reach out to Anne in the final months of her life? What could have been so urgent, so personal, that she broke years of silence to write to the Queen's famously reserved daughter? Whatever was inside that envelope, it had survived decades untouched, and now the world was desperate to read it. From the moment it surfaced, the envelope stirred something deeper than curiosity. It was sealed, not just physically, but emotionally, tied shut with years of silence between 2 women who never quite saw eye to eye. Princess Diana's personal red wax crest wasn't just a formality, it was her signal, her way of saying, "This matters." Experts knew it instantly. Unlike the traditional royal crest, used for formal statements and correspondence, Diana's private seal was used rarely, and only when she was speaking from the heart. Former staff members confirmed it had been reserved for just a handful of letters throughout her life. It symbolized something unsaid: trust, and she chose to send that level of trust to Princess Anne? That alone shocked everyone. Anne, the Queen's only daughter, had long represented stoicism, tradition, duty above all else. Diana, by contrast, was warmth and vulnerability, a voice for compassion, a disruptor of centuries-old silence. The two had always moved in different emotional orbits. They'd stood shoulder to shoulder at royal events for years, but with barely a glance between them. Distant, measured, civil, but never close. That's why this letter was seismic. The seal had protected the envelope for 26 years, and incredibly, the paper hadn't aged. No tears, no discoloration. As if time had preserved it intentionally. It was as pristine as it had been the day Diana wrote it, in early 1997, just months before her tragic death in Paris. And it wasn't the only detail that raised questions. Inside the flap of the envelope, barely visible under the seal, was a faint imprint, Diana's initials intertwined with a tiny heart. It was something only a few of her closest friends had seen her use in handwritten notes. A deeply personal flourish, never used in official documents. It turned a royal letter into something more human, more intimate, something meant for eyes that truly mattered. What could Diana have possibly written that required this level of secrecy? Was it a warning, a peace offering, a final request from one mother to another? Royal watchers debated endlessly. Had Anne known of this letter all along, or was she just as surprised by its reemergence as everyone else? The palace, predictably, remained silent. But handwriting experts who studied Diana's notes from 1997 confirmed it was genuine. Her paper, her pen, her rhythm. One thing was undeniable. This wasn't just another artifact from a lost princess. It was a message waiting to be heard, and the seal, still unbroken, was the only thing standing in its way. When the letter was finally opened under controlled conditions at the British Library, there was a moment of total silence. No phones, no cameras, just the sound of breath being held. And then, Diana's voice came through as clear as if she'd written it yesterday. Dated February 1997, the letter was penned just months before the crash in Paris that ended her life. But this wasn't a letter full of fear or despair. It was calm, measured, thoughtful. The handwriting, her unmistakable looping script, was steady, not rushed. Each line carried weight, not drama. She didn't open with emotion. She opened with respect. Diana acknowledged the distance between her and Anne right away. She called it a gap we've never bridged. But instead of defending herself or explaining past choices, she offered something completely unexpected: admiration. She praised Anne's loyalty to the crown, her unshakable sense of duty, her ability to remain private in a world that fed off chaos. She admitted they'd never truly connected, but insisted that didn't mean there wasn't understanding. Then her tone shifted. Diana began writing about her sons, William and Harry, her fears for their future, her worries about the palace, the press, and what she described as the tightening grip of tradition on children who were born for something more. She didn't ask Anne for sympathy. She asked for help. "If anything should happen to me," she wrote, "please be the one who protects their ability to choose." It was a stunning appeal. Diana wasn't asking Anne to raise them. She was asking her to defend their freedom, to be a shield inside the very system Diana had spent years trying to escape. She didn't explain why she was writing now or what prompted the urgency, but her words carried the weight of someone who knew she was running out of time. There was no panic in the letter, but there was a quiet awareness, a sense that the walls were closing in, and that someone inside the palace needed to understand what was at stake, someone like Anne. By the end of the letter, Diana's voice softened again. She thanked Anne, not for the past, but for considering the future. She signed it not with a formal title, but simply Diana. Underneath, she had written one final line: "Sometimes the strongest bond is the one we never saw coming." And just like that, a 26-year silence between two of the most private women in the royal family broke long after one of them was gone. No one expected Diana to write to Anne. They weren't friends, they weren't allies. If anything, they were two sides of the same crown: duty and emotion, silence and honesty, tradition and change. And yet, in her final months, Diana didn't write to the Queen, to Charles, or even to her sisters. She wrote to Anne. Why? The answer wasn't political, it wasn't about status, it was about trust, the rare kind that comes not from closeness, but from recognition. Despite their history, Diana saw something in Anne that others had overlooked. She saw someone who never broke, someone who never played the media game, someone who had survived the royal machine without losing herself. And maybe that's exactly what Diana wanted for her sons. In the letter, Diana didn't sugarcoat their differences. She referenced past slights, misunderstandings, and the emotional distance that had hung over them since the early 80s. But she never blamed Anne. In fact, she admired her. She called her the only one who never pretended. That line hit hard. While others smiled for cameras and whispered behind doors, Anne had always been brutally direct. She didn't charm, she didn't flatter, but she didn't lie. And in Diana's eyes, that made her rare, especially in a palace full of performances. Diana's request wasn't for affection, it was for protection. She asked Anne to look after William and Harry, not as their mother, not as their friend, but as the one royal who wouldn't fold under pressure. She knew the world was changing. She wrote about the growing power of the press, the collapse of public trust, and the suffocating expectations that would crush her sons if no one stepped in. And though she couldn't predict how things would play out, she suspected one of them, maybe both, would eventually rebel. In Anne, she saw a kind of quiet strength. Not emotional, not warm, but reliable. Someone who, if push came to shove, would tell the truth. Someone who, when things got ugly, wouldn't look away. And so, Diana gave her something that she gave very few people: responsibility. "If I am no longer here," she wrote, "please don't let the silence win. They'll need someone who sees the cage before they're locked inside it." It was raw, unexpected, and for Anne, perhaps deeply uncomfortable. But it was also a final gesture of faith, from a woman who'd once been dismissed, misunderstood, and exiled, asking another woman who knew that road too well to guard what mattered most: her boys. Diana didn't just pour emotion into the letter, she laid out a roadmap, one that reads today like prophecy. In early 1997, she wrote about a monarchy standing at the edge of a cliff, unaware it was already starting to crumble. She warned that the world outside the palace was moving faster than the royals realized, and that if they didn't change, they'd lose control of the narrative forever. She called the media a storm that never stopped circling, and feared it would eventually consume her sons. She predicted that William and Harry would be raised under a spotlight too intense for any child, and that unless the royal family adjusted, they'd be forced to choose between duty and freedom. One would try to modernize the crown. The other, she wrote, might walk away entirely. Every line now feels chillingly accurate. She spoke of tradition as both strength and burden, warning that rigid expectations could break the very people they were supposed to protect. Diana wasn't angry in the letter, she was focused. She described the royal household as a machine with no reverse gear, and begged Anne to be the one person inside it who could see the truth from the outside. She also reflected on her humanitarian work, particularly her campaign against landmines, which she said had given her life a real purpose after the collapse of her marriage. But that purpose came with risk. Diana didn't name names, but she referenced powerful people who are not pleased. She said she'd felt watched, followed, and overheard. But even then, she never sounded panicked, only prepared. And still, her biggest concern was never herself. It was always William and Harry. She worried they'd be raised in fear. Fear of emotion, fear of mistakes, fear of disappointing the institution. She wrote, I've already seen the way Harry's spirit dims after palace lectures. And William, he carries the weight already, even when no one asks him to. To Anne, she offered one last request. If the world won't change in time for them, please help them change their world. No royal had ever put something like this in writing before, especially not to Anne, the silent enforcer of tradition. But Diana had, and everything she feared has happened. The pressure, the rebellion, the split. One son stayed, one son left. And the monarchy? It's still scrambling to catch up with the future Diana saw coming. In the final months of her life, Princess Diana seemed to move with both purpose and unease. To the public, she was radiant, confident on humanitarian trips, photographed on yachts, making headlines for her bold advocacy. But behind closed doors at Kensington Palace, those who truly knew her noticed something else. She was preparing. Her longtime butler, Paul Burrell, remembered walking into her study in early 1997 and finding her surrounded by sealed envelopes and scattered notes. The lights were dim, the windows closed. She was calm, but there was a weight in the air, as if she was racing against an invisible clock. She was writing like someone who knew her words needed to outlive her, Burrell later recalled. These weren't the usual thank you letters or invitations, they were instructions. Some for her charities, some for close friends, and a few, more serious than all the rest, were clearly meant for only one pair of eyes. Among them, the letter addressed to Princess Anne. She had started writing more frequently in those final months. Her private secretary noted a change in her handwriting, once graceful and smooth, now rushed and urgent. But the tone of her letters remained deliberate, composed. Diana wasn't unraveling, she was getting clear. She told those close to her that she felt watched. Her phones clicked. Cars lingered outside her gates. She wasn't paranoid. She was aware. She spoke openly about powerful enemies and dark forces, especially after her anti-landmine campaign started ruffling international feathers. Her walk through an active minefield in Angola had stunned the world and upset people in high places. Still, she kept going. It was during this time she began reaching out to people she hadn't spoken to in years. She was settling accounts, reconnecting threads. Some of her friends received touching notes, others received warnings. But the letter to Anne stood apart. It was calm, precise, the tone of a woman laying down a final card, quietly and with care. Diana knew Anne wasn't close to her. She knew they had little personal connection. But she also knew Anne was one of the few royals who didn't lie, didn't leak, and didn't play games. That mattered. Diana needed someone she could count on inside the system. Someone who didn't need to love her to understand her message. And that message was simple. If she didn't survive this moment in her life, someone had to protect the freedom of her sons. Anne wasn't her ally, but she was her best hope, because in her final months, Diana wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid of what the monarchy would do to her boys once she was gone. Diana and Anne were never close. They shared titles, duty, and palace walls, but not warmth. Their relationship, if you could call it that, was cool from the beginning and only grew colder over time. But that distance wasn't born from a single argument. It was built over years, out of silence, subtle slights, and two women who were never meant to walk the same path. Anne was royalty by birth, raised to prioritize the institution over emotion. From a young age, she knew how to stand still, say nothing, and get the job done. She didn't seek attention. She rejected pampering. Even in the media, she was blunt, dismissive, almost uninterested. She was the royal family's steel spine, tough, controlled, and unshakable. Diana, on the other hand, wore her heart on her sleeve. She wasn't born into the royal spotlight. She was thrown into it at 19. She connected with people through emotion, not protocol. She cried publicly, touched those deemed untouchable, and often spoke when the royal rulebook said to stay silent. Her humanity made the world love her, but inside the palace, it made her a problem. Anne didn't hide her disapproval. She found Diana's popularity frivolous and her openness embarrassing. Palace staff recall moments where Anne dismissed Diana as too soft and too much. Diana felt it. She later confided in friends that Anne never offered support, never checked on her, even during the darkest times in her marriage. Their most public rift came in 1982, Prince William's christening. It was expected, almost assumed, that Anne would be chosen as his godmother. It would have been a powerful symbolic gesture, strengthening ties, showing unity. But Diana chose someone else, someone personal, someone who had stood by her emotionally. Anne was hurt, but she didn't argue. She didn't have to. She simply skipped the ceremony. In 1984, it happened again. Prince Harry was born, and again Anne wasn't chosen. This time, she made her feelings known more clearly, retreating to her estate and making it clear she wouldn't bend for Diana's decisions. After that, their divide became permanent. At royal events, Anne and Diana stood apart. They never exchanged more than polite greetings. In family photos, they avoided standing side by side. The public guessed, the tabloids speculated, but inside the palace it was understood. Anne kept her distance, and Diana stopped trying. And yet, Diana's letter changed the narrative, because for all their differences, Diana saw something in Anne that no one else did. Honesty, not warmth, not affection, but integrity. Diana didn't trust easily, but in her final days, she trusted Anne to do one thing no one else might have the courage to do: protect her sons from the machine that had nearly destroyed her. Not with love, with strength. Diana's letter wasn't just a reflection of fear, it was a forecast, a warning wrapped in hope. And as the years passed, almost every word proved true. Today, William and Harry live out two entirely different realities, exactly the kind of split Diana had sensed was coming. William, the heir, chose to stay within the royal fold. He married Catherine Middleton, a commoner whose grace and grounded nature helped him modernize the monarchy from within. Together, they've broken away from cold royal traditions. Their children go to regular schools, they show affection in public, and they speak about mental health openly. Things Diana once fought for, often alone. His reign-to-be is one built on quiet evolution. Harry, on the other hand, broke away completely. In 2020, he and Meghan Markle stepped back from royal life, shaking the monarchy to its core. They moved to California, cut ties with royal duties, and spoke out about mental health, racism, and what Harry called the invisible contract between the royal family and the press. It was bold, painful, and exactly what Diana predicted. In her letter to Anne, Diana had written that one of her sons might choose freedom over duty. She didn't judge that choice, she defended it. She asked Anne not to stop it, but to shield it. There may come a day, she wrote, when love and legacy are no longer found behind palace walls. Let him go. She didn't say which son it would be. She knew it could be either. And though Anne has never spoken publicly about the letter, her actions suggest she listened. Sources inside the palace say she quietly supported William's decisions to slim down the monarchy and raise his children with fewer formalities. During family meetings, she's defended him. And with Harry, she remained silent, exactly the neutrality Diana requested. Margaret Wells, a former aide, revealed that Anne still keeps an old newspaper from August 1997 in her private study. The headline reads, "Diana calls for royal change." It's folded, worn, but clearly preserved. She never talks about it, Margaret said, but she never threw it away. Even the royal institution, long resistant to change, now echoes Diana's voice. A streamlined monarchy, public conversations about mental health. Less pomp, more purpose. These weren't trends. They were Diana's pleas, ignored at the time, honored years later. Her letter to Anne wasn't just about sons. It was about survival. And in many ways, it's the reason her legacy lives not in crowns, but in choices. For over 2 decades, the envelope sat in silence, untouched, unopened, tucked away in a private collection, sealed in red wax, and shadowed in mystery. It carried no headlines, no scandal, no fanfare. Just Diana's handwriting, her voice, her truth. Now, finally revealed, it's clear this was no ordinary letter. This was a message crafted with precision, written in the calm before the storm. A final chess move from a woman who understood the rules of the game and how they were rigged against her. Diana wasn't asking for pity in those pages. She wasn't venting emotion or reliving past pain. She was doing what she'd done in quiet for years, trying to make sense of a future she feared she wouldn't be there to shape. Her words weren't desperate, they were deliberate. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all? She didn't send that final letter to someone who had always supported her. She sent it to someone who had never pretended to. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, and for years, Diana's coldest peer. Anne had rarely offered kindness. She had never intervened in Diana's darkest moments. But that, Diana realized, might have been her greatest strength. Anne didn't play favorites. She didn't manipulate. She didn't lie. She simply endured. In a royal family that often chose image over integrity, Anne had stayed blunt, real, and quietly resilient. And to Diana, that made her a safe place, perhaps the only one left. In trusting Anne, Diana wasn't searching for sisterhood. She was making a strategic appeal to the one royal who knew exactly how to survive inside the system without being destroyed by it. And what Diana asked for wasn't sympathy. It wasn't even affection. It was a promise to protect her sons from the same institution that had torn her down. "If I am no longer here," she wrote, "don't let the silence win." Now, decades later, that silence is broken, not with scandal, not with accusation, but with truth. Because everything Diana predicted has come to pass. William has redefined royalty without severing from it. He's become the royal Diana hoped for. Grounded, emotionally present, human. Harry walked away entirely, refusing to trade his peace for the palace. 2 sons, 2 paths, and both walking in the direction their mother hoped they'd choose for themselves. Even Anne, who never asked for recognition, seems to have kept Diana's words close. She never spoke of the letter publicly. She didn't need to, but those close to her say she quietly backed William's decisions, that she never condemned Harry, that she never ever dismissed Diana's fears. And perhaps that is her answer, not in speeches, but in silence. The monarchy today is slimmer, quieter, more aware of its fragility. Diana's letter didn't break the system, it warned it, and though it took years, someone was listening. This letter, once sealed in wax and hidden in a forgotten box, now stands as one of the most important artifacts of Diana's legacy. Not because of who it was sent to, but because of what it revealed. That Diana never gave up, not on the family, not on the future, not on the chance that someone, anyone, inside the palace might help protect the freedom she never had. She wasn't asking to be saved, she was asking to be heard. And now, finally, she is. And now, after all these years, Princess Diana's voice rises once more. Not through a speech, not through an interview, but through ink on a page. A private letter, written in the quiet, addressed not to the world, but to the one person she thought would understand when it mattered most. Not because they were close, but because they were honest. Diana knew her time might be short. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She made a plan, and in Anne, she saw the strength to carry it forward. Today, her sons live out the legacy she hoped for. Freedom, authenticity, and the right to choose their own paths. The royal family, whether they admit it or not, is still moving in Diana's shadow. Because that letter wasn't just a warning, it was a blueprint. And now that it's been found, no one can ever say she didn't see it all coming. If you found this story as powerful and haunting as we did, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Anne fulfilled Diana's request? And what would Diana say about where the monarchy stands today? We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching.